It's Tuesday, October 15th, 2013, and you're listening to SYN Boldly, the podcast, the Sign Your Name Project. I'm your host, Trey Comstock. With me this week, as ever, is Kathleen Royston.
Hello.
Missing this week, as unusually, is Stephen Doss. However, in Stephen Doss's absence, we will persevere, and we will talk this week about the purpose of mission. We will talk about Flannery O'Connor's prayer life and the purpose of government. However, we start tonight with the purpose of mission in the news. So I want to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Harrison Thornhill, who's a good friend of ours.
Hey, buddy.
He pointed this story out to us, and we decided to pursue it. It's interesting. A website called Ministry Matters, which is kind of a place for information for pastors and editorials and stuff. They have a Twitter feed, as most journalistic outlets, including ours, do. Subscribe to our Twitter feed. Dink. SYN Boldly. But they have a Twitter feed. And they throw kind of links to their articles, and they seem to also throw out thought-provoking quotes. And so Harrison sent this along and wanted us to discuss it. Today, about 4 hours, we record this about 8 o'clock on a Tuesday, so about 4 hours ago, so kind of middle of the afternoon today on October 15th, they threw out this little gem. There are only 3 kinds of Christians when it comes to world missions: zealous goers, zealous senders, and disobedient. And it's a quote by a guy named John Piper. Now, I didn't know who John Piper was, so I did something journalists do called research. And
on Wikipedia, I would like to point out.
Not just Wikipedia. I actually found, the big thing that I found is I found where that quote comes from. That quote comes from a document that John Piper published 17 years ago, in 1996. So why is it news? Well, it's news because they threw it out there. It comes from a document called Driving Convictions Behind Foreign Missions. John Piper is the pastor of a very large, or was the pastor of a very large Baptist church in Minnesota called Bethlehem Baptist Church. And he wrote this kind of, with a guy named Tom Steller, wrote this kind of missions manifesto where this quote comes from. The actual paragraph it comes from says, "May the Lord cause them to capture your heart and fill with fresh zeal for the greatest cause in the world. There are only 3 kinds of Christians when it comes to world missions: zealous goers, zealous senders, and disobedient. May God deliver us from disobedience." So basically, it's this idea that at the core of Christianity or Christian theology is missions. And particularly, he's viewing it as world missions. That in order to be an obedient Christian, from his perspective, you need to be somehow involved in world missions, either in participating in sending missionaries. They could be fundraising or whatever, I guess. He doesn't really get into specifics. Or it can be being the one who goes. I find this interesting. I do a fair amount of international missions as kind of a function of my life. But I wonder, Kathleen, what you think of Christian theology being boiled down to, if you're not specifically participating in international missions, you are disobedient in the eyes of God.
I'm still trying to work this out with what a strong Calvinist John Piper is. Can you give me a second while I think about this?
Sure.
Because if you're a double predestinarian, which according to Wikipedia, that source of all news, he is.
So you want to explain what a double predestinarian is?
I mean, not everybody speaks it. Double predestination is the idea in Calvinism, although not in John Calvin's thought, that you are predestined to, my understanding of it is you're predestined to either go to heaven or not. So you're elect and you either are or you're not. So I'm a little curious how the idea of world missions comes in with that. If people are elect and everything, there's election
Sure.
of the, it's unconditional election.
Oh,
I know
I mean-
my tulip. How do you deal that with world missions?
Well, I don't know.
I'm curious.
The Puritans still tried to convert the
Good point.
Native Americans. So it is that kind of tension in even double predestinarian Calvinist thought that while they think you're either predestined or you're not, there still are massive missionary efforts. So it is a little intention. It is a little intention. Excuse me, I can't talk today. But I do wonder, boiling it down to participating in world missions. And I think the thing that sticks with me in particular is world missions. We're getting to a place, and this quote comes from 17 years ago, but in the life of the church, that isn't all that long ago. My life, it seems hugely long ago. I was in elementary school. But
I'll punch you.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting that he says world missions. And we're getting to a place in Christendom or in the church where missionary efforts, as traditionally conceptualized, are being massively scaled back with a focus on local leadership. It is hard to say that there's a corner of the world that hasn't, at least in some way, been exposed to the gospel. And at this point, the majority of Christians are not in the Western world, or not in the global North.
I think what's interesting about this understanding of missions is how closely it's tied with proselytizing. That this is not necessarily, in the Methodist Church, when we talk about the Global Board of Missions, it is not sending people to go and tell people about Jesus. There's a lot more active, school building and well building and things like
Sure,
that.
I mean,
There's
what I hope to be doing.
right. It's not about making sure that people believe in Jesus so they won't go to hell. And I have to wonder if that's a little bit of what's going on here is if this is, and judging from what I know about John Piper, which admittedly is not a ton, that if that's your theology, you have a strong, there's a strong need to go and help, in your eyes, tell people about the gospel so they don't suffer eternal damnation. It's an enormous incentive.
Sure, but why do you have to? And look, this is an argument from a person who's kind of committed their life to going. I guess I would count as a zealous goer under this, this framework. But why is it a requirement to go abroad? Because so often, especially those kind of proselytizing efforts, are so culturally insensitive as to be nigh worthless. And they're not just an exportation of the gospel, they're an exportation of all the other crap we wrap the gospel in.
They're colonial.
Right. And so
nature.
One of the things that I always get challenged with, and I often respond, that's not my particular calling, is there's a lot of need, however you want to define that need for God. There's a lot of need for God here.
Yeah.
And how can you say that someone who is zealously participating in urban ministry, or who is, zealously planting a church in in a community that hasn't really been reached yet, with a church that's relevant to them, or whatever, how can you say that they are disobedient because they have not taken that go out into the world so literally that the world can only mean beyond the borders of the United States?
I think that I'm guessing that there's a taking the Great Commission in Matthew very, very literally. So the go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations.
Sure. But
That I think that there's this idea that it doesn't, at home isn't all nations. I mean, and I think maybe built into that a little bit is the idea that what happens in the United States is somehow norm and everything else is not that norm.
But at this point in world history, that's from the Christian church, that's crazy.
Yeah.
The majority of Christians are in two continents, and neither of them are North America.
Absolutely.
They're in South America and they're in Africa. We are no longer a Western religion. We
Absolutely.
didn't start out as a Western religion.
Will not
and we won't end up a Western religion, and we are no longer a Western religion. Africa and South America are the two most Christian continents. Europe has, the church has faded some in Europe. That doesn't mean there isn't still very valid and beautiful Christian expression coming out of Europe, but it's no longer the seat. And I always tend to go back to professor of mine, Wild Bill Daniels. He'll love that I call him that. Is a missions professor that I've taken a couple classes from. And, he cites a guy named Andrew Walls, who was his thesis advisor, that one of the true gifts of the church is its ability to move from the center to the margins as the center crumbles. So if you look at Palestine and the Greek world, right after the death and resurrection of Christ, they were at the seat of power in Palestine just as the temple fell, and then they moved to the margins of the Greek world. And this happened again. They were at if you look at Great Britain and Europe, Christianity was at the center of power, and it slowly moved to the margins in the United States, as just as the center began to crumble. And again, as Western Christianity struggles and starts to crumble as a center, it has moved back out into Africa and South America. And so it's what gets called the pilgrim principle, that there's something fundamental that moves, that does this motion from center to margins. And how the church is able to survive is not this ability of the center just to go out and say we're the center and we have to do this, but for it to be able to live and grow on the margins.
I do think that there's a real resisting of that in the U.S. because acknowledging that means acknowledging that our time of the center is nearing an end, and that's scary stuff. Particularly, for people in churches who have historically had lots of clout and power. It's scary stuff.
Well, I think it's scary for us in particular too. Because the theology of the majority of Christianity does not look like mainline Protestantism, and which is kind of what this perspective from which we talk. It is a very Pentecostal faith.
But I do think that, and you and I have had this conversation repeatedly, is having. There's something that needs to happen where reverse colonialism can be an issue. So reverse colonialism can be an issue. So if, international expressions of Christianity are brought into into our context,
which they're actively sending missionaries to us now.
That's problematic too, because I think one of the strengths of Christianity is how contextual it is. That all of it is hopefully speaking to one truth, but the languages used are totally different. And I don't just mean the verbal ones. So I think that that's really important, and I think that this kind of understanding that the U.S. is going to go send missionaries to, deepest, darkest, pick your continent.
Which is funny, because I'm a missionary who does these things, but yeah.
But is very, and with all that goes with that, so with cultural values and economic values and all of that stuff is deeply problematic, just as it is problematic for the rest of the world to send missionaries here and tell us that we're not being Christian in the right way.
I think there's two ways to look at this. It is either, it is either death to American Christianity or a remarkable chance for us all to share. That there are aspects of the truth that we hold, and there are aspects of the truth that they hold. And, Christianity is at its broadest reach ever in human history. And we have this chance, this is another one of Wild Bill Daniels' theories, is that we have this chance to really be able to share in a global church. And in a way that we've never been able to, both in terms of the reach of Christianity and in terms of the communications technologies that can facilitate this communication. And
I think there's a real difference between sharing and imposing. And that goes for everybody. And I think that particularly in the United Methodist Church, which is, as everybody knows, our context, finding this balance has proved to be very difficult.
Yeah, but I think, if you look at the focus of the General Board of Global Ministries now, it is much more focused on stuff like flood relief and on
Yeah.
sending out theological educators
Yeah.
to seminaries that are struggling to attract faculty,
Yep.
and those kind of things, rather than a lot of like, buy Bibles, send preachers with Bibles.
Right.
There's actually like kind of a rogue Methodist group called the Mission Society, based out of here in Atlanta, that has kind of taken over that that role of missions because the United Methodist Church isn't doing it. And so they're the ones sending the conversion-focused missionaries for the most part, and we're much more... and one of the reasons I call myself a missionary, to be a little deliberately provocative, is to me, I see our role in missions now as participating in the building of the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And however that works. So I'm getting a degree in public health, and I have a degree in education on top of the MDiv, to be able to go out and have these kind of tangible skills and participate in a process working alongside local leaders and local pastors, and just be able to participate in this, whatever this kingdom of God is becoming.
Well, and join in things that are already going on. I think the most successful mission efforts are not the ones that are imposed from the outside.
No.
But my family has worked for the past about 10 years with a camp in Costa Rica, the camp director is an American, but married a Costa Rican, and it's very much the effort of the local church there and that community. And I think that's one of the reasons that it has done what it can do and had the reach that it has, is it wasn't this outside imposed thing. And that's very powerful. And I think as Christian leaders, remembering that is really important.
Well, it's interesting. In the past 2 summers, I've done extended posts in Kenya and in Paraguay. And one of the things that I always get great joy in seeing is just being a part of these communities that are already experiencing the love of God in each other. And in Paraguay in particular, Kenya, most of Kenya's economy is NGOs, non-governmental organizations trying to build Kenya. It's actually Kenya's biggest industry is NGOs. But in Paraguay, there really isn't. There really isn't that kind of outside force. Yeah. It's much more, all the organizations we were working with were very local and very homegrown. And we were just being a part of these organizations and falling in step with their work, and maybe, doing some research to help their work, or doing this documentary to help them promote their work. But just being a part of local work that was ongoing, and it felt a lot more sustainable and a lot less skin of the teeth than a lot of the stuff I was seeing in Kenya. And there's a lot of kind of philosophies and theologies behind that. But one of the things I've been studying a lot is the philosophy of Paulo Freire, who's this kind of really famous community organizer guy from South America. But he has this methodology to help communities work together in a process of transformation. And that if there's any outside force, all that is a facilitator, is an inspirer, is someone who's prodding and bringing people together and saying, okay, talk, and then helping make sure that dialogue is productive. And then that's it.
Yep.
And to me, I think that's, the goal of missions at this point. And, I have this dream of expanding what is right now a small media arm, but I hope to someday this be a missions organization called Rose Window Ministries, that's doing exactly this kind of work, this kind of grounded in an idea of community transformation, of a network of small solutions that are locally driven, to build the kingdom of God that way, rather than viewing the kingdom of God as something that's being imposed down upon, but being the kingdom of God as something that is emerging in the life of community.
And I have to wonder, and this is the sort of weird place that I've been going lately, is within the United States. I'm going to get in so much trouble for saying this. I have really mixed feelings about these short-term mission trips that churches do. There, I said it. And not that they're in and of themselves a bad thing. I think they can be really powerful, but I think recognizing that those are about the people who go on the mission trips and not the people who are being served, that's where a lot of that transformation happens. But there is something really powerful about long-term sustained relationships between churches in the United States and churches in other parts of the world, that after years and years and years of going even for a week at a time, something happens.
I think a lot about short-term missions because I mean that's how I got started.
Yeah.
And we believe in a kingdom of God where we share in a connection. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily getting rid of short-term missions. It's redefining what it's about. If it is about going to encounter other Christians and to share in that together, I think it can expand people's horizons on both sides. But to me, it's less in what's happening and more in how it's pitched. If you're pitching it as we are going to save these people and we are going to be Jesus among them, well, no, that's full of it.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about we are going to see Christ in each other and worship together, there's something really powerful about people from different contexts worshiping together. I did this, ran this church camp, helped run this church camp in Poland, where we brought a bunch of American youth to hang out with Polish Protestant youth. And those were hugely powerful worship services. Mm-hmm. And both children from both youth from both nations, they wouldn't want me to call them children, they are children though, children from both nations walked away with their hearts strangely warmed.
Yeah.
Now, we did not pitch this as we are going to save these people. We pitched it as they can't afford to run a church camp, and so we're going to run a church camp for them. That seemed a lot more reasonable. And what happened was something truly beautiful and truly an emerging of the kingdom. But it was pitched in the right way, and this was a long-term relationship that had been going on for 10 years. So short-term missions within a more long-term relationship pitched as sharing in faith rather than bringing Jesus, there's something remarkably valuable in that.
And I also think not only, long-term partnerships between churches, but like if you send the same 10 people once a year for 10 years, it's incredible. I look at the relationship that my parents' church has with this camp in Costa Rica, and I've been 7 or 8 times, and my dad has been 15 or something insane. And what has happened with that and what the church that he's at has taken this one camp on as one of their primary missions. And it's relational and it's incredible, and the connections that we have with people at the camp and with people at the church. I mean, these are good friends. I think it's really powerful. So
something else that we found extremely powerful is the news story you found this week.
Yes. So I just got back all of 3 hours ago from Greenbow House of Prayer, which is a prayer retreat started by 2 actually United Methodist lay people. It's in middle-ish Georgia, and it was one of the coolest things I've ever done. It was a silent retreat, which for someone who
literally talks for a living,
makes a living running her mouth, it was absolutely wonderful. And so I had a lovely day yesterday. I got to do all kinds of fun stuff, but I was about to go to bed last night, and I got out. I had brought 3 copies of the New Yorker with me because I'm like 3 years behind, thanks seminary. And I pulled it out. I pulled one of the issues out, and I was just shocked. There was a feature on Flannery O'Connor, which is kind of awesome since we were kind of near Milledgeville, which was lovely. But what I'm gonna do, we're gonna do something totally different. I'm going to read in my best public radio voice. Are you ready, Internet land? In January 1946, while studying at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, Flannery O'Connor began keeping a journal in a ruled Sterling notebook. O'Connor, who had left her home in Milledgeville, Georgia for Iowa, turned 21 in March and had her first short story, The Geranium, accepted for publication that month. She was a devout Catholic, and over a year and a half she filled the notebook with a series of entries addressed to God. The following excerpts from her journal chart her thoughts on the subject of faith and prayer and her hopes for her fiction. Dear God, I cannot love thee the way I want to. You are the slim crescent of a moon that I see, and myself is the earth's shadow that keeps me from seeing all the moon. The crescent is very beautiful, and perhaps that is all one like I am should or could see. But what I'm afraid of, dear God, is that my self-shadow will grow so large that it blocks the whole moon, and that I will judge myself by the shadow that is nothing. I do not know you, God, because I am in the way. Please help me to push myself aside. I want very much to succeed in the world with what I want to do. I have prayed to you about this with my mind and my nerves on it, and strung my nerves into a tension over it, and said, "Oh God, please," and "I must," and "Please, please." I have not asked you, I feel, in the right way. Let me henceforth ask you with resignation, that not being or meant to be a slacking up in prayer, but a less frenzied kind, realizing the frenzy is caused by an eagerness for what I want, and not a spiritual trust. I do not wish to presume. I want to love. Oh God, please make my mind clear. Please make it clean. I ask you for a greater love for my Holy Mother, and I ask her for a greater love for you. Please help me to get down under things and find where you are. I do not mean to deny the traditional prayers I have said all my life, but I've been saying them and not feeling them. My attention is always very fugitive. This way I have it every instant. I can feel a warmth of love heating me when I think and write this to you. Please do not let the explanations of the psychologists about this make it turn suddenly cold. My intellect is so limited, Lord, that I can only trust in you to preserve me as I should be.
Wow. Wow. It's remarkable what happens when someone who can write very well prays, and puts the weight of that gift and lays it before the Lord.
I think what I love so much about, and this is published in the September 16th article of The New Yorker, and I checked on Amazon and there's a book, all of them, these are excerpts, all of the journal entries are coming out in mid-November. But what is so remarkable about these is how she at once recognizes her gift, prays for her gift, and knows that she wants to succeed about it and is very honest about that, and that there's this constant back and forth too, with recognizing where that gift comes from, being afraid that she's in it for the wrong reasons, but then wanting to not be in it for the wrong reasons. And if you've had the joy of reading Flannery O'Connor, she's an absolute genius. And to see her want so badly to succeed, is really powerful.
Yeah. No, that was
Isn't it?
It's very beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I'm mostly speechless. It's it literally, and for very good reason, speaks for itself. That there's a humility and a depth there that I think a lot of folks should strive for.
My favorite line was the "help me get under things and find you."
Yeah. It's a cool image.
Mm-hmm.
So, for something kind of to transition to something very different.
And now for something completely different.
Is this week's discussion. So, the government of the United States remains shut down. We are in, yet another week of shutdown. We talked about the shutdown 2 weeks ago. And here we are. That's still with no functioning government. It's still with great pickup lines. Hey, I just met you and we're on furlough, so call me maybe. But I wanted to talk about the different positions that are being set up. And for me, what I'm seeing is the emergence of two different sides of stewardship. There's the one side of steward that says we need to be a good steward of our resources, and there needs to be a balanced budget, and we can't be in debt, and so to be a good steward is where, as God calls us to be, we need to be financially sound. And then there's a side of this debate that's saying to be a good steward is to care for the least of these, and that the core function of a government is to make sure that the least of these are also cared for, and that the government is really the first line of defense for that. And this kind of gets played out in two news stories. I know this is discussion, I'm talking about news. This plays out in two news stories that happened this week. The Value Voters Summit met this week, and it's a Christian right-ish summit to talk about issues and how they're going to promote their position on issues. And, they talked about abortion and gun control or lack of gun control, and they talk about kind of the normal values voters, what gets called values voters, or focus on the family or Christian right values. But Salon.com points out in an article called, The Religious Right is a Fraud, Nothing Christian About Michelle Bachmann's Values, and it's a little provocative, it's Salon.com. But despite the provocative headline, there's a very interesting story there. That they talk about how most Christian parties around the world, or specifically citing the Christian parties in Europe, have poverty as one of their core tenets. They may also take conservative positions on social issues, but still the combating of poverty and social justice is core to what they're talking about. This is not the case for the Value Voters Summit. The Values Voters Summit in no way talks about poverty, and so that is significant in its absence, that to them being a good steward has nothing to do with poverty. And Salon.com is kind of countering that and prodding the Christian community to think about what are our values really, and what should they be. There's also the story of how, for a little while, the EBT system, or the food stamps debit card system, crashed. And so, for a little while, food became free if you had food stamps, because your balance was essentially unlimited. One woman who had a balance of 50 cents remaining in her card got $700 in groceries. And they were just ransacking a Walmart and, just, what is actually theft, or taking advantage of this glitch. And it's an interesting image of self-respecting people being put in this position where there's this glitch and they go crazy. You can look at this two ways. Either they went crazy over this because they were so desperate and they were just reacting out of desperation, or they were committing felony food theft. And in a way, both are probably true. But it's this idea, it's pushing these two ideas in tension. That one version of being a good steward is not having people be dependent on the government, and that we need to balance our budgets and make sure that we're not furthering dependency. And that gets constructed as a Republican argument, and that's the nice way of presenting that argument. There are many not nice ways, but that's, I think, giving their core principles a fair read. There's the other side that says being a good steward is caring for the least of these. But with that philosophy, there's a risk of dependence. With the Republican philosophy, there's a risk of not actually caring for those that we're called to care for. And so I wanted us to talk about this idea of being good stewards and how we see both sides of this argument. So Kathleen, what are your thoughts on stewardship?
My thoughts on stewardship are that I think the biblical text is pretty clear about this. I think that what comes up in the largest chunk of the Old Testament is nations that fail to care for the poor are not doing what they're supposed to do. And not that I believe, let me be very, very clear, I certainly do not believe in America as the new Israel. However, I think that is the rhetoric that gets played out on the right quite a bit. And so following that logic, part of keeping that covenant as special chosen nation involves caring for the poor. Not that I believe in that argument.
But even if you take that outside of the specifics of a government.
Yes.
Because what we're talking about is values voters, which is presumably religious people. That even if you don't think of America as the new Israel, we are the people of God and we are the body of Christ.
Right. And that is clear from initial law in Torah, that caring for the poor and widows and orphans and strangers, because we were strangers, all of that is so built into the fabric of Christianity that I'm continually shocked when that gets pushed aside. And especially as other, quote, values things are taken out of particularly the book of Leviticus, about homosexuality, how you don't see the people who are arguing against homosexuality arguing against kicking people out of the country, which is just as strong of a law.
But I also find it interesting, Leviticus also talks about caring for the poor.
Absolutely. A lot.
I mean, that's part of Leviticus is very focused on what it means in that context to be a holy community, to be a community set aside. And so part of that was a series of purity laws that, get thrown around a lot in the debate on inclusion, but also being a holy community, being a community set aside, was to care for those that get left behind. And
I've been spending a lot of time in the Holiness Code in the middle of Leviticus. And Leviticus 19 is part of this. And it's, what does it mean to be a holy people of God? And holy people of God don't glean their fields to the very edges. They leave food for the poor. Holy people welcome strangers because they remember that time that God got them out of Egypt. I mean, there's all of these things, and so I think that biblically it's hard for me to think of values voters as really voting these religious values, because it misses, they pick certain texts and then it seems like they miss the whole.
Well, this is only 3 chapters. 3 chapters after the kind of key argument against homosexuality in the Old Testament, and so you have stuff like 10:19.
Where's the
19:10, which is Leviticus 19:10. You shall not strip your vineyards bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyards. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God.
There's more. And look at us quoting Leviticus.
Yeah, well, it's just...
and there's... Oh, here we go. You shall have... Where is it? The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. I mean, these are strong, powerful texts. And so I think... And then, so after Leviticus... other stuff happens, and then you get into the prophets, which have even harsher words to say about breaking covenant and failing to care for the poor and cheating the poor. So I think that it's pretty clear, particularly in the Old Testament. And then Jesus shows up, and I think that if we pretend that Jesus was an American capitalist, we are not reading the right Bible. And I think that I just find it so hard to hear anything that the Christian right, so this is going to sound terrible, it's hard to hear anything they say about values issues when I see this gross, in my eyes, gross negligence to take care of the poor. in the most effective way possible. I think the argument you will hear from people on the right is, oh, we're not against taking care of the poor, we just don't think the government should do it.
Right, but that's illogical. There's a political science scholar named Walzer that I had to read a lot in college, and basically one of Walzer's arguments is that charity doesn't work because it's inefficient. That the party of economic efficiency then seeks the least efficient way to care for the poor and downtrodden, because individual charity is actually very wasteful. What's efficient, is with healthcare, by the way, is a single payer system, and so all of the money gets funneled into one entity, and then that entity can evaluate the needs. Now, conservatives don't necessarily trust government, and so they don't think government's the way to do that, but government's actually the institution we have assigned to do that, and we can make it work better or worse. And I'm not saying our government's perfect. Our government is currently non-functional. We are a failed state. Hi. But the theory behind government is that it should be that system that can do that. Only the government can amass the government and Bill Gates are the only two entities that seem to be able to amass the billions and then give it away in a way that actually helps people. But thinking through maybe not necessarily what's being advocated at the Value Voters Summit, but if you look at the core thesis of the Republican Party, and this idea that the government shouldn't be broke, there's something to that. U.S. is carrying, $16 trillion in debt, to the point where we currently can't we have to go further into debt to pay the interest on our debt. That is a very troubling position to be in. And the cycle of dependency that has often been created by the welfare system, not always, but sometimes, is also troubling, and isn't, I think, what's really meant by caring for the least of these, is to create this cycle of dependency that is kind of getting the food stamps debit card glitch is getting seen as like this big example of the negative effect of dependency on the human condition, and you can debate whether or not that's true, but dependency in this way is painful to the human soul. And so, what is the balance, right? Right now, the U.S. government is spending itself further and further into a hole without any seeming end to it. Now, okay, let me counter. We're also trapped in a position where no one believes in raising taxes ever. So, okay.
Well, and I think things like the Iraq War...
Yeah, okay.
I think if you look at, I think that's something that gets, and I am not an expert on this at all. There's my disclaimer. But looking at, is most of the money being spent on social programs?
The simple answer to that is define social programs.
Okay, let's see. Public education.
No.
Medicare.
Yes.
Social Security.
Yes.
Yeah.
So look, there are three. Look, there are only three things that matter in terms of spending in the United States government, and everything else is small potatoes. Number one is defense. Number two, Social Security. Number three is Medicare. Everything else doesn't matter. Yep. So I'm trying to bring up the percentages because
and things like food stamps and all of that
are incredibly small programs.
And I think that when those get cut, the psychological, I don't want to say damage, that's a little overdramatic, but the message that sends is so powerful. And is that really what's going to do it? And I think about the cycle of dependency. I mean, quite frankly, I think that education's a really good thing. Good public education is incredibly powerful. And I have serious issues, like the Methodist that I am, with vouchers for private schools and things like that, because I think there is something about good, solid, equitable public education that is incredibly helpful.
So,
looking at things.
24.64% of the U.S. government spending this is specifically from income tax, went to defense. 22% went to healthcare. And that's not counting the automatic deductions for Social Security and for Medicare. The major spending of the U.S. government is just those three things. Is Medicare, Social Security, and defense. Now, Medicare and Social Security are actually aims at social justice. That's what they were created to be, was an aim at social justice. But it's hard to say. We go through and we cut all of these small but hot button programs and then leave out kind of the 1,000-pound elephant in the budget.
The hot pink ones. The hot pink elephants.
Which is defense. An F-22 Raptor fighter costs $1 billion a plane. $1 billion per plane. The Republican Party, led by the Tea Party, cut the few million that they gave Teach for America to supplement the teacher education aspect of the program through AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps is just a few $1 million. And so far, often in these negotiations, defense is the sacred cow. We can't touch defense. Well, if you can't touch defense, any limited in spending is ridiculous. Because, yes, okay, fine, if you believe us as Team America World Police, which is certainly part of our national identity, whether or not it should be or not, we're not debating war here tonight. But even if you believe that, you're spending $1 billion on a plane and then cutting food for people who can't afford to eat in one of the richest nations that have ever been, with a military that would make Rome blush.
Here's the other thing about that, is the more it's the thing about, well, I'm gonna get in trouble, but with defense spending, the more you have, the more you need, and at some point it's this escalation, and at some point, why?
Well, I mean, that's somewhat of a different topic. But, I mean, I guess if it's looking at stewardship, yeah.
Like, what are we really protecting?
Well,
what are we really doing?
There are two different views of that, right? The charitable argument is we are protecting those who can't protect themselves. And in that way, helping to guarantee freedom worldwide. The other read of that, look, I'm just throwing the arguments out there. The other
so I can make the face I just made?
Yeah, absolutely. The other read of that is we are trying to hold on to U.S. preeminence. When I was in college, we talked a lot about United States hegemony. And hegemony was not a word I had heard until my freshman year of college. But basically, the U.S. as the dominant nation in the world. Now, since, 2005 when I started college, and now, that you can't really talk about U.S. hegemony anymore. You have to talk about, it is at least a bipolar system again with us and China, and let's keep in mind that China holds a good amount of our debt. So, deal with that. So, the other argument is we have this big military, and one of the things I talk about with my brother, who's an economist, is the way military spenders approach our military spending is not just that we have the biggest military. It's that we have the biggest military, bigger than all other military spending globally combined, which is, by the way, close to true. We spend more on our military than, like, our nearest 10 equivalently sized nations added together.
on my understanding of it, at least anecdotally, is we spend on our military, but not on our military personnel. So, things like veteran services and all of that kind of stuff, that is also prey to budget cuts in some very heartbreaking ways. Is that a fair assessment?
I can't necessarily speak to that. I don't know. Actually, maybe the World Bank, bail me out. Come on, World Bank data.
Oh man, that's a blast from the past. I haven't seen that in a long time. You spent a lot of time on that.
Come over to the public health side, sister. We got your back.
Woo! That's
this doesn't have what I was looking for, but I don't actually know I can't speak to the breakdown in spending. Why does the United States? Okay. 4.4 what? 4.4 what? Yeah, we're doing research. This is a fact-checking ruins podcast. Okay. We do spend an inordinate amount of money, not on our people, but on the stuff that goes into it. Okay, here's part of what I was looking for. This is, of course, according to Wikipedia, but they're pulling it from a reliable source. The United States spent $682 billion on defense. Okay? Total worldwide, $1.7 trillion was spent on defense. Put that another way, the U.S. is spending close to 1/3 of all military spending globally. Our nearest nation in terms of size, in terms of wealth, in terms of however you want to count it, is China. China is spending $166 billion. We are spending roughly 6 times what China is spending. I can't do math, forgive me. Phrase another way, we spend 39% of all money spent on military worldwide. China spends 9.5%. It doesn't necessarily matter how that money is getting divided up. You want to talk about social justice, you want to talk about balancing a budget, you want to talk about good stewardship, fine, let's have that conversation. We probably shouldn't be $16 trillion in debt and having to take on more debt to pay the interest on our debt. I get it, that's an insane system. But if you want to have that conversation as a values voter, to me, defense has to be where this conversation starts. Not as that last resort, only in the most dire of straits. And on that note, it is probably time to end. Thank you so much for joining us on this slightly less balanced edition of SYN Boldly. This is what happens when Stephen is not here to devil's advocate us. If you have any feedback and want to rant at us for our positions, please send your feedback to synboldly@endfear.org, facebook.com/the Sign Your Name Project, or @SYN Boldly on Twitter. And thanks again to Harrison for suggesting our first story. It was remarkably fruitful. And go in peace to love and serve the Lord and end fear by signing your name. Good night.